I immediately believed my child, but I didn't want to believe my child. I loved this man. This man was my soulmate.
Well, nobody believed me. No, I mean, so there was really no way to tell anybody. I just knew that nobody would believe me.
I remember growing up and wishing, like, I wish a stranger had done this to me so that my family doesn't have to choose between, like, me and my abuser.
I always say it's a huge problem. I think, like, even when you look at the numbers, we say 1 in 4, but I believe that that number's much higher.
I think something that's really hard is when you do this work for long enough, you can't see them as numbers, you see them as people. So whenever I read the statistics, it honestly breaks my heart, because I know that there's a person and there's a story behind all of that. Thinking about the fact that, like I said, 39% of Kentucky women have experienced contact sexual violence, 18% of men. How 46% of sexual assaults have happened before the age of 18, it breaks your heart, because you know the impact that has on an individual, on their trajectory in life. And people can heal, they can move forward, they can thrive, but how different would life be if they never had this experience in the first place? Yeah, it's staggering, honestly.
Well, when I was younger, I was pretty aware of my family's situation. I knew that my abuser was an important part of the financial stability of my family. So I knew that I didn't want to mess that up.
When I was 15, I was in an abusive relationship. It was mostly sexually abusive, but I actually didn't know that for about 3 years. I knew that I was uncomfortable with a lot of the things that happened. I knew that they caused me a lot of stress. What happened in that relationship didn't happen again with other people for a little bit, and so I knew that that was different, but I didn't realize that it was assault.
I started karate when I was about 11 years old, and I got really close to my karate teachers in that they became like in my life on a day-to-day basis, to the point that I would go to their house. So I started doing karate at a church. Then they would have like kind of like isolated training like at their house. So I would go there. And when I moved, they ended up moving in the area that I lived in. And so I started going to their house to train again at about 12 years old. And that's when they kind of started the grooming process of like grooming me to like, I think the first time I ever felt anything weird was like, you know how mothers like, hey, I'll see you later, and kind of get you a hug and a kiss. And she was like, well, you didn't give him a kiss, you know? And so that started the process of them kind of grooming me into this.
It is everywhere. And it likely could be the person that you're rolling your grocery cart past at Kroger. Because we never know. Because sexual assault doesn't come with like a certain color, you know.
The thing is that it's not usually the stranger in a park that is this type of abuser. It's usually, and statistically, it's going to be the person or people that are close to you, that you trust the most. You know, they're really good at manipulating the people around you too. So although I understand it's hard to believe that your best friend of 25 years abused somebody else's child, it doesn't mean that it didn't happen.
We don't want to believe that our son raped somebody. We don't want to believe that our daughter or our mother sexually abused her child.
When I did realize that I was different, my mother took me to a therapist, and that therapist took advantage of me. And so that was my experience of therapy. So it was very hard to realize that something bad had happened.
I experienced sexual abuse as a child. So as a mother, I felt like I was hyper vigilant in looking for that. Well, in March of 2018, my daughter disclosed that my then husband had been sexually abusing her for at least 2 years. And then my oldest daughter disclosed that he had been grooming her in various ways.
A lot of times parents will come in and they'll say, my kid is just not the way they used to be. And they start to talk about drug use, isolation, thoughts of suicide, clothing changes, all kinds of just attitude and not respecting rules in the home, and, you know, school grades plummeting. And I'll say all of that is a response to trauma that they have encountered. The question needs to begin to change from what's wrong with you to what has happened, right? Because what's wrong with you, ooh, what does that do? That places blame on the person. Instead of when we say, gosh, what's happening? What's happened? That opens up the possibility to have a conversation.
The first time I remember, I was 12. And the instances that have been kind of sprinkled throughout my adult life were mostly in my mid-20s. There weren't terribly many of them, but there were enough that they stuck with me for a while.
So unfortunately, I was not dealt a very great hand in life. I experienced sexual abuse when I was a child for quite some time. Timelines are very confusing when you experience trauma, so I'm not entirely sure, like, for how long, but probably a little over a year with more than one individual, so very complex trauma. So yeah, I've been like a survivor my whole life without even realizing it.
So, my experiences with sexual violence started when I was just 5 and would last basically the entirety of my life up until I was 22 years old, and I'm now 33.
I was 19 years old, and I was a very ambitious young woman. And I had all these dreams laid out for me that I was going to achieve. I was good at school. I was good while I was in university. I was doing very well. And then somebody thought it a good idea to put me in my place, so to say, and sexually assaulted me one night while I was out with my friends.
So my experiences with sexual violence starts at a very young age. I was 11 years old. It started with, so my mom, when I was growing up, she taught me that it was good to be able to ask questions to people you trusted. So my grandmother, she married a man who knew that. He knew that about me and my mom's relationship. So he was like, how do you know what boys and girls do? I, of course, didn't know what he was talking about. I said, no. And at that point is when he started doing things such as he would show me how to kiss a boyfriend. He would try to prepare me for having sex because he wanted to have sex with me before another boy did.
So when we think about who's most at risk for sexual violence, we kind of have to think about the root causes of violence in the first place. Looking at sexual violence as a public health issue, we know that it's not about sex, and it's not about sexual desire. Sexual assault and sexual violence is really about power and control. So it's someone leveraging their power that they have over another person in a particularly sexual way. So what this means when we're looking at it from a prevention lens is you have to think about who in our society has less power and the situations in which that can be leveraged to harm them. So when we think about these statistics that I just talked about, young people are particularly vulnerable for sexual assault. So 46% had experienced it before the age of 18. When we think about the ways in which society is set up, young people are particularly disempowered, and I think that's a real issue that we're working on. But this also expands to other folks who have different identities that may have less power, just societally speaking, thinking about it in gender, in race, in immigration status, in socioeconomic status. So folks in poverty, that sort of thing. The conditions of people's lives can provide either protection for them, so supportive things, helping them to be empowered, or it can put them at greater risk for experiencing violence because of the way that sexual assault kind of functions in that realm.
Stigmas keep us silent. Stigmas keep us in shame. And so those stigmas that feed that shame include victim blaming, slut shaming, bullying. So when you look at our media and you look at an individual like Rose McGowan, who came forward and she said, "Me too, I'm a survivor." And people are like, "Oh my God, she's crazy. Like, look, she's off her rocker." That's another reason why people don't come forward. It's the stigma of, I will now be seen as different.
And I do know that gay guys and gay ladies, they don't necessarily feel comfortable, especially in Kentucky, sharing intimate details of their life, especially if there's been violence or domestic violence. They don't feel comfortable sharing that with somebody that they might perceive as being not part of their community.
It's so interesting, like people will talk about it behind closed doors, but then when it comes to like trying to address it, there's like so much shame. I was still in elementary school, and I remember feeling like so guilty for what had happened. And I told my parents, and I was like crying, like, I'm so sorry that this happened. At the time, I was just so confused. I felt like the more people in my life that knew about it, specifically like my family or members of my family, it was just like the more people trying to like silence me. And so kind of around the time in middle school that some of the other members of my family started to get involved. And I think we're just all trying to figure out a way to move forward.
So my day-to-day has been impacted so much more than I had realized, even after therapy. Back then before therapy, it was isolation. I couldn't tell anybody. I had this like weight on my shoulders and my chest. Constantly felt like I couldn't breathe.
I believed the stigma, and I believed that I had been in the wrong place, I had been in the wrong company, I had been in the wrong dress, I had been out at the wrong time, and I had done these things. I had controlled what happened that night. And so I kept in silence because I didn't want anybody else to find out.
There is a lot of concern about victim blaming because when a traumatic event happens to us, to our bodies, we have these negative thoughts that get kind of like imprinted in our brain, negative cognitions. One of those cognitions is, it's my fault, right? And many, especially children, talk about, it's my fault that this happened, right? And so the blame, and the reason that happens is because we're told throughout life at different times, oh, it's your fault for whatever, it doesn't have to be sexual abuse. But then that gets to be our story. And so why come forward if my story that I've created is one of, it's my fault?
It took me 8 years before I heard the term rape referred to my experience, and it would be 20 years later before I actually accepted that fact that it was a violation and that it was of no fault of mine.
The abuse that I suffered was, early adolescence. It wasn't a family member, it was a trusted friend of a family. So you would have never known, looking at me from the outside, that anything was going on. I didn't tell anyone. It wasn't until, the past couple of years that I told anyone at all. It was really difficult. It affected me. In a lot of ways, it made me feel guilty. I thought it was my fault. It made me probably stay in the closet another 10 years, longer than I would have. I wanted to be anyone else other than who I was. But aside from that, I didn't want to tell anyone. I didn't actively try to fight it off. So in my mind, I thought, it's something that I asked for somehow, or that I sought out in some way. So not only did I blame myself, I didn't want to make anything harder on my family.
So why are survivors often reluctant to seek help? I'll share with you a few that I've heard. How about that? And these are from real people. No one is going to believe me. I was told that if I told that he was going to kill my dog. I was told that if I told, he was going to kill my mom. I didn't seek help because I tried before and people told me just to get over it, and I thought maybe that's what I had to do. People don't seek help because sometimes they don't know where to go for help.
Because there's many layers to uncover, you talking about the psychological effects, which vary from person to person, and then you have also justice barriers and different things that they have to work through, family relationships, the way it impacts parenting, and so I would say giving it more time gets to kind of dig into that stuff in detail, and also being in a group dynamic provides a space to remove shame. It kind of reminds me of AA, how you have people oh, I've been through this, and they're kind of starting to take off that layer of shame that keeps them from healing.
I think that I did fall into a pattern of even thinking that that's what I deserved, that I think that I put myself into spaces that were dangerous even. Not that it was my fault, but that I was reckless. I think that even part of it just has to do with the culture that we all face.
I had tried disclosing to a parent when I was younger and was met with immediate silence and disbelief, and so I carried a lot of shame around that and never tried to disclose to anybody else.
You know, if somebody were to steal your car, you know, you'd be like, yeah, they came to my house, they broke and took my keys, stole my car, right? But, you know, how do you say, you know, somebody stole my virginity, you know? And that's a different type of crime. It's very personal. I mean, it's something that's uncomfortable to talk about. I think that you have to work through your own shame and guilt about it too, because in some ways, even myself, I blame myself for ending up in that situation.
You know, the girl's father, you know, is still in the picture, which is not their abuser. And I think I was more scared to tell him than to tell anybody else. And I was afraid of what his reaction would be. You know, there was, in the very beginning, I was terrified that my children were gonna be taken away from me. The guilt and the shame that I felt as a mother, having not seen or known any of the signs coming from an abused background myself and trying to be so careful, and I didn't protect them. He was very good at hiding it. It makes you hate yourself. It makes you hate yourself as a person and a mother. I only realized what had happened to me after several months of going through the legal process, is that he had actually raped me twice. And I didn't admit it or really think about it until after we went through all of that. And
up until 1990, in Kentucky, it was legal to rape your spouse. Just think about that. And until that law was repealed, think of how many individuals suffered because of a law that said, yeah, you can rape your spouse. It's legal.
So for me, in the past at least, I've very much fallen into patterns of hypervigilance is one of the things that comes with experience with trauma. So being on edge all the time, constantly looking over your shoulder is a big way that people refer to it, and trying to be prepared for the worst to happen. That is the thing I've dealt with. It's disrupted sleep, things like that before, and generally through those symptoms, it's impacted my overall health. And over the course of working on my own mental health, which I've had to do for a long time, things started coming up. I remembered things from childhood that I lived through. And that rolled over into, again, trying to manage things on my own, was one of them. And ended up trying to manage it largely through substance abuse, predominantly alcohol. And that obviously did not work after a certain point, so.
By the time I graduated high school, I hadn't, did any, drugs or alcohol other than, normal high school parties and things like that. But when I got in college, I kind of went wild. I was doing my best to suppress all the things that happened to me. And so I did every drug that I could do. I don't think I missed any drugs. I did them all.
A lot of people have this thought of drug addiction and alcoholism as being in our DNA. Trauma leads to addictions. Systemic oppression leads to addictions. And so if we can begin to change the way we think about addiction and see this as a person who has experienced trauma, we can then develop compassion and empathy and change that question from one of what's wrong with you to, oh man, what's happened? And that piece allows for connection, allows for curiosity, and allows for someone to be able to hopefully disclose and say, this has happened to me.
So coming out of that, realizing that, okay, so I'm not severely mentally ill. But those kinds of things stick with you. They're very hard to get over. And so naturally, I did turn to drugs and alcohol to deal with that. I don't believe that how I survived that. I just don't.
I'm doing better, especially with therapy and healing, but some days are better than others. I still have panic attacks. I still do have triggers that I deal with, but I'm more resilient and more equipped to deal with those as they come. But it definitely, it finds me on days, and it's still always there.
I would say that I've had a few barriers in sharing my story, in the sense that, you would think that if you tell your friends that this happened to me, that they would stop associating with the person with the perpetrator. And I experienced the opposite, where they still invited into parties and without even inviting me there. It was the first time that I thought, they don't believe me, or else they wouldn't invite him here anymore. So hard. I lost those friends. Actually, the way that I reacted to it is what made me lose them. I didn't actually drop them. They stopped associating with me.
For the first 8 years after I was assaulted, there was no healing. There was only a lot of masking of pain through maladaptive behaviors. I was promiscuous, trying to gain back some kind of power and control that I thought that I lost, that I thought I could regain through being promiscuous. I was drinking excessively. I was engaging in risky behavior. I was even suicidal. And it would not be till 8 years later when I received the diagnosis of PTSD and bipolar disorder, which the theory was that I had latent bipolar disorder that was brought forward when I experienced intense trauma.
Trauma is so complex, and I wish it was just like this one thing that I could process and move forward, and it's like, it's not. There's so much, and it's like, this is just the tip of the iceberg. I was diagnosed with PTSD during the pandemic, and so initially for me that was flashbacks, and I couldn't leave my house. I was so scared. Kind of like the typical manifestations, I guess, that you see in survivors. And I think now it's more like I have good days, I have bad days, but I think now my trauma, it still continues to impact me, and how I view myself, how I view the world, my relationships with people. And it's hard because it feels like I'm having to learn all these things that I was never taught.
People think it's about sex. Hell no, it's not. It is about power and control, because sex is about intimacy, about love, attraction, and it's about consent between two adults. Children cannot consent to sex. Vulnerable adults cannot consent to sex. It's about power and control. It's about I want and I'm taking. I think all sexual assaults are premeditated because there is an element of grooming. There is an element of manipulation. There is the element of anticipation on the perpetrator's part. And that is not spur of the moment. Spur of the moment, to me, is I'm in McDonald's drive-thru and I'm like, I just ordered a Big Mac and I'm like, oh, can I change my order? Oh, I actually wanted a quarter pounder instead. That's spur of the moment. Not rape or sexual assault. It is most definitely premeditated and power and control. That myth of you have to fight back or you have to say no in order for it to be rape. Like I remember in the 90s when I was in college, like that was like the verbiage and the words, and that is not true. And here's why this is not true. And I'm going into biology and I'm going into neurochemistry here. So our nervous system has 3 states. We have ventral vagal, which at the top is when we feel safe and connected. And then we have sympathetic, which is I'm gonna run away, I'm gonna fight my way, or I'm gonna freeze. And then we have dorsal. And dorsal is what I akin to a possum. So when a possum is attacked by a dog, it plays dead, right? And then within a few minutes, you go back out and you're like, where's this dead possum? Oh my gosh, it's already gone. Because it did what it needed to do to survive. So when another human being is being violated by a sexual assault, by a rape, our nervous system is going to kick in, and 9 times out of 10, we're not going to be able to run away. We're not going to be able to fight our way. And so my nervous system says, the only thing we need to do is survive, and how we're going to survive is we're going to shut down. So yeah. Consent is all or nothing. It is very concrete. There's a beautiful video that I like to share with adults and kids that I work with, and it explains consent in the form of drinking tea. So very simple. If somebody does not like to drink tea, you're not going to force them to drink tea. If somebody says, yeah, I think I'd like some tea, and then a few minutes later they're like, no, I don't want any tea, you don't force them to drink the tea. If somebody liked tea on Saturday, but they didn't want tea on Monday, you don't force them to drink tea. Consent is simply that. If somebody is unable to say yes throughout all stages of engaging in a sexual activity, it's not consent. If somebody is being coerced into having sex, that is not consent. So when we begin to broaden our understanding, then, the amount of people that have been harmed astronomically grows. But consent is very black and white. It is, if a person says no, that is the answer. And you stop. And if they cannot say no because they are passed out, you don't touch them at all.
Yeah, I honestly feel like it's my duty to tell my story because I think that it's hidden too often, and I think the effects of it are too damaging for us to be silent, And a lot of times I feel like victims live in shame when really the shame should be on the perpetrator and not the victim.
I went to a doctor and I was prescribed some medication that helped immensely. But the only reason I'm sharing that is because, there's no shame in asking for help if you need it in any form. Luckily, I had a really good support system. I had my mother, who has since passed. She was wonderful. I had some really good friends.
So I had 2 best friends that I talked to, and I still talk to them daily. So we were each other's support. They hadn't dealt with any abuse, but they did understand. Since then, though, I went in and finished school, finished college, got married, moved out of the toxic environment I was in before, and am generally happy now.
It wasn't until I was almost 29 years old, and in 2018, me and my now husband were engaged at the time. We were supposed to get married then, and we ended up calling off the wedding. He basically sat me down, looked at me, and told me that he loved me with everything, but he could not continue to watch me destroy myself, destroy my kids, and destroy him. I went to a couple different places, seeking help, seeking therapy. I ended up going through like 3 different, but I have just done a lot of work over the past 4 years of healing, and finally got to a point where I felt like I was okay and I was thriving. And of course, we got married in September of 2022, so.
My sister became my biggest support at the time. She still is, but she was younger at that point, so she was just, I'm there for you, you know. And now she calls me every day. I was in my bachelor program for my BSW when I first came here, and at that point I said I'm not going to stop until I have my master's degree, because what I want to do is come to a place like this to help other people. So I feel like that was really the start of my healing, and I was in therapy for over a year, working through everything that I didn't know was really bothering me, because I thought, oh, it's my fault. You know, I blamed myself, felt all kinds of shame, guilt, and it took me a little while to overcome that, to finally realize that I didn't make this up, like this is real. I have no reason to feel shame. Now that I've went through court and therapy, I finally felt like I could breathe again afterwards.
The main thing that I would hope for and I would ask for is just listen to people and believe them. The kind of harm that can be done from not believing someone in the first place is far, far greater than believing them and having to maybe make up for that later. And not believing someone when they do speak up about something is one of the biggest ways that people are prevented from actually getting safety and recovery.
I think the first decision I made was to write about it. I had no intention to publish. I didn't know what I was going to do with this. I wrote for my children. I wrote for my children because I wanted my daughters to have record of the pain and that I went through, and the strength and courage and resilience that it took for me to stand here today to tell my story. I wanted my children to know that that ran in their blood.
One of the things that I would love to see Kentucky do is to speed up the trial and legal process. You know, with one survivor recently, it was a 4-year-long process. 4 years. That's 4 years of waiting. That's 4 years of worry. 4 years of, can I really close this chapter on healing when this is still looming, because we don't know what this outcome is going to be.
I just want to add that I think we have to start respecting the bodies and the lives of women in general, but in particular Black bodies and Black women's bodies. I think historically we have not received the justice that we should receive in the justice system, and we've been disregarded. You know, sometimes our truths have been disregarded, depending on who the information lands in front of. And I think that we have to start removing biases as a society so that we can help all victims, you know.
Alcoholism, addiction, poverty. There's a lot going on in the world right now. And are the children okay? You know, do we look at families? Are we supporting families right now? You know, when I was raised in the 70s, you know, our sitcoms were way different. In the 80s, it was a family sitcom. We don't really have that stuff anymore. We don't really have our media or entertainment teaching us how to treat each other. We have a lot of reality shows where people are just generally awful to each other. And an entire generation of people have learned their interpersonal relationship skills from the Desperate Housewives of wherever. That's a reality. So it's children being raised in that environment. So are children being abused in a culture such as this? Yeah, that's why it's more prevalent. And it's not, I don't think it's the parents' fault. I don't think it's anybody's fault. It's just the way the culture is.
You know, like the Me Too movement has been so impactful. And like seeing so many people in like really tough situations going against very powerful people and that being broadcasted all over the world, like that's so inspiring. And at the same time, it was so isolating because I was like, no one looks like me. No one's had the same experience as me. And it wasn't until I found this like great organization that like creates resources for Muslim survivors. And that was like such a turning point in my life because I truly felt like I'm not alone, like other people have experienced this, like, and just that like makes all the difference, knowing that like someone's had that experience as you. And like, it's sad, I don't want anyone to have this experience. It's almost like comforting to know like no one else has experienced, or to have the idea of like, it's okay if I'm the only one, because I don't ever want anyone to have to go through this.
Dealing with any kind of trauma, and in particular sexual violence, can feel incredibly isolating. It's the type of experience that it's easy to get in your head and be like, no one wants to hear about this. No one's gonna help me with this. No one really understands. I don't know anyone who's been through the same thing, and convince yourself that those things are true regardless of whether or not they are. So I guess that in a way I kind of got in my own way of recovering in a way that would have been healthier, maybe faster. So more than anything, I would like to try to tell other people who've lived through sexual violence that they don't have to convince themselves that other people deserve services like this more than they do. That was a big part of my own like mental rhetoric, was like, oh, it wasn't as bad as things that other people have been through, so I don't need it as much. I'm not like in the worst case scenario, and that's what this is for. And that's not true.
I think it's completely unacceptable that anyone experiences sexual violence, this such intimate form of violation. It's not okay with me. When we think about primary prevention, really what it means is stopping violence before it starts. It's that simple. And so when you think about the public health model and some of the things that help to explain that concept, one of the ones that people talk about a lot is this like upstream approach. And so the way it's explained is, imagine that, you know, you are at a river, right? And so you're enjoying your day on the river, it's great, it's sunny, you have a picnic, whatever. And you see people starting to float down the river who need to be saved. So you go out, obviously, because you're a good citizen, you go out and you save the person, and you're like, okay, we saved him, great. But then more people start coming down the river, more people start coming down the river. Maybe you get other people on the beach to help you save these people out of the river. But if you don't think about why are the people falling in the river in the first place, you're just gonna be in this reactive, let's pull people out mode. So the upstream approach is thinking about going upriver to see what are the conditions and causes that are having people fall in the river in the first place. So maybe it's, you know, a hiking trail where a landslide has come through and there's no more trail there and people are falling in, or maybe a bridge has a hole in it that you can't see. So, you know, that's kind of like the simplistic, you know, abstracted way to think about it, but the same thing happens for all public health issues, which sexual violence is a public health issue. You know, we see the impacts at our rape crisis centers when survivors come in our doors. We see the impacts that it's having, and we are there to support them 100%. But we also need to go upstream to say, Why are people experiencing these things in the first place, and what can we do to keep that from happening? So Green Dot focuses on teaching people how to be active bystanders when they see situations that could be potentially harmful or dangerous. So we teach our students and our community members what's called the 3 Ds. So how to intervene directly.
It teaches people how to do something and say something. So when you're encountering a situation, right, that is not okay, you can either be very direct. You can intervene one-on-one, right? Hey, this is not okay, stop, for somebody else.
How to delegate if that you're not okay with doing it directly.
So you can go and tell somebody, hey, I need help, right? Can you come with me? Or call 911.
Or how to distract and diffuse the situation.
Distract is a beautiful tool of intervening in such a way that you're distracting in the moment and you can get someone into a safer position. It's anti-bullying, it's anti-violence, and it works. It's research-based.
So we give people the tools that they need to be able to safely intervene in potentially dangerous situations. The goal of prevention is to create safe and healthy communities where everyone can thrive. And that doesn't just benefit survivors, that benefits everyone. Everyone can be better living in a place where folks are looking out for each other, where we care about our neighbors, and that sort of thing.
A victim of sexual abuse may not think that there's anyone out there that has experienced the same thing as them, or there's no one like them that has went through the same thing. But it's so widespread that I think people would be surprised at the number of people that have dealt with sexual abuse.
What happened to you is not your fault. There are people out here who believe you and who want to support you, thinking about our local rape crisis centers, the services that they have. And also, there are people working to keep this from happening to someone else. I think that's really important for survivors to hear, is this isn't inevitable. We can prevent this, and that's what we need to do.
When people hear my story, I hope that they learn that there's someone out there that they can relate to, that they're not someone who's been through whatever it is that they've been through, and there's no one who could ever relate to them or talk to them about it. I would want them to not feel alone anymore.
There definitely is a light at the end of the tunnel for every person that goes through similar situations. Every survivor can get to their light. The only way to do that is to fight. And I feel like, made it to the light at the end of my tunnel, because I'm no longer having the child that was inside of me scream for help.
I am in a place of peace. I think I've worked very hard. I've wrestled a lot of monsters to get to where I am, but I still grapple with anxiety and trauma triggers and responses, but I think I'm more apt now in my healing to be able to handle those better.
I would say I'm doing really well now. I have 3 kids, 3 great kids, beautiful kids. I love the work that I do. You know, I actually don't feel like I go to work. And that, I think, talking about just how my job, my pain has fueled my purpose. You know, it has fueled my passion, and it's given me like a reason to really look forward to helping the next person, you know.
I've certainly made strides. So I went from being essentially a homeless drug addict to, you know, graduating college and getting married, buying a house and a car. So I'm proud of myself now for the first time.
I got this from graduating my intensive outpatient therapy program. On the front of it, it says, "Serenity isn't freedom from the storm, it's the peace within the storm." Then on the back, it just has like an ocean scene. And for me, it reminds me of, just completing that program and how important that was for me, because it did change my life.
You can either take your anger and your pain and keep it in and let it destroy you, or you can take your anger and pain and put it into something. I chose something creative, and this way I can reach more people. This is a piece that I created shortly after I found out about our abuser. It is called A Mother's Heart, and I created this and made it look like stone, and then this is a depiction of a mother screaming. So it just really kind of depicts how I was feeling at the time. This is a sketch of my hand, actually, and a butterfly just representing growth and peace. This was done probably, about 4 years after this had occurred, that we had been through the process of court and all that. So
on my right arm, I have an entire sleeve that's dedicated to my journey in healing, where you will see it's a skeleton, which represents death, the lowest part, the darkest part. The skeleton you will see is covered in flowers, lotus flowers, just representing growth in general. And of course, I call myself the beacon of, I will light the way for others to find healing too. And the skeleton is actually holding a lantern in the dark, lighting its way for others. So as I'm still healing myself, you can see my growth, but I will go back into the dark and help others find their way too. And that's what the whole entire sleeve was dedicated to.
But I think at the end of the day, there are some shared experiences between all survivors. And that's that solidarity and that support has helped me so much. And so I hope that I can offer it to someone watching this, even if I'm not physically with them, or if I don't know them personally. I just hope that my identity will encourage anyone who, maybe feels like this isn't being talked about in my community. There's no one that looks like me. I've been in that position, I am in that position, and it's hard. And I kept waiting for someone to come forward and be the first. And I was like, it's gonna be me, I guess.
Hey, if you're going through hell, keep going. There's an exit to that stuff at some point.
It's such a powerful thing to be amongst other survivors, to know that we're going to be okay, and to hold each other up like that. And so I think these are the things that are offered by our local sexual assault resource center, and it's a resource that's invaluable to survivors like me. I had arrived at the perfect time. I was wrapped in the love of my friends, of nature, and of strangers and their kindness. In that love, I saw myself for the first time. I was part of something bigger than myself or my inhibitions. It had taken me almost 20 years to accept what had happened to me as a violation. With that acceptance, I knew my life was in my hands. The state of mind that was abrupt and unpredictable was within my control. I was finally open to learning. All that had happened in the past was by design, stepping stones that led me to my present. I had stepped into my magnificence, and I was worthy. The past was the past. There was no changing it. But at least now I had the power to change the lens through which I understood what had happened to me. And finally know it was not my fault.